Hi, welcome. Welcome, welcome. Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute or so as we welcome everybody into our meeting today. And then I'm going to make a few announcements and we'll get going. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat and say maybe where you're attending this meeting from, we'd love to sort of see who is attending and where our reach is. From Florida. Welcome. British Columbia, California. Very nice. A lot of Americans I'm seeing on here from the US. Sydney. Oregon, California again, New York, another Sydney. Great to sort of see our both being in the United States and in Australia right now. Well, wonderful. Well, for the, I think we're going to go ahead and get going. So first of all, welcome everybody to our Climate Reality Book Club for April. My name is Madeline Karp. I'm our chapter's program manager here at Climate Reality. And it is a joy to be able to share the book that we are going to be discussing today with you. I'm so honored to have both of the speakers that we have today. And I hope that it's going to be a wonderful conversation. While we're talking today, before I introduce them, I do want to acknowledge we have an active chat. Feel free to participate and share your thoughts in that chat. We want to hear from you throughout this conversation and make sure that you're also discussing with each other the inspiring ideas and topics that come up today. I also want to draw your attention to the bottom of the screen where there's a Q&A. If you have questions right now off the top of your head or as this conversation gets going for either of our panelists today, please put those questions in the Q&A and we'll have some time at the end to be able to discuss and to go through those questions too. So we definitely want to be able to hear from you as well. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce both of our folks here today. So first and foremost, we have Joëlle Gergis, and she is an award-winning climate scientist and writer of the book that we are going to be discussing today, Humanity's Moment. She's authored over 97 publications, and her general audience pieces appear in The Monthly, The Guardian, The Saturday Paper, The Griffith Review, Harper's Bazaar, and The Conversation. Joëlle was a lead author on the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, and is also an advisor to the Climate Council, Australia's leading independent body, providing expert advice to the public on climate change and policy. So it's an honor to have her here today as a scientist, as a communicator, as an activist in this space. We're also joined today by our moderator, Edwina Floch. She is the co-founder of Le Rose Bleu, which is a French social impact wine that raises awareness for ocean plastics, funds educational and prevention initiatives in partnership with Plastic Oceans Foundation. She's on the Australian Committee of Nexus and a member of the Groundswell Giving. And she's also headed strategic relationships at Documentary Australia Foundation. So a wealth of experience with different kinds of ways of raising awareness around environmental issues around impact. But importantly for this conversation, she's the founder of the Environmental Music Prize, which is a global first that amplifies the voices of artists who inspire action for climate and conservation, incentivizing talented creatives to create powerful music videos that connect us to nature and encourage us to protect it. The 2023 finalists have been selected by environmental leaders and including some of Australia's most critically acclaimed artists. And they will have been revealed, I think, as of Earth Day. So we encourage you to check them out, and we'll be providing lots of links and messaging around that. So you'll be able to check out both of these incredible folks' work. But without further ado, I want to turn that conversation now over to them. Like I said, please remember to interact in the chat and include any questions you might have in the Q&A. But it's my pleasure to turn it over to Joëlle and Edwina. Oh, Edwina, I think you're on mute.
Joëlle, over to you.
Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for the fantastic turnout from all over the world, really. It's a really great honor to have the opportunity to speak to people from the US, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
Great. Hi, I'm Edwina Floch. I am also absolutely delighted to be part of this global conversation on this global issue, and most particularly to be speaking to Joëlle, who you will see as someone who combines both head and heart. Before I start, I'm just going to do a quick acknowledgement to country. Some of you from around the world may not be familiar with this practice. It's something that's, more recently started to be done in Australia to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. Obviously, the First Nations people in Australia have a continuing connection over 60,000 years. And so I live in Sydney, which is Gadigal land. And so I acknowledge the people of the Eora Nation and their elders past, present and emerging. But I also want to acknowledge everyone's past ancestry. Many of us are migrants of the world and global citizens. So I think this moment as we project into the future is also a moment to reflect on the past and where we've come from and our duty of care to future generations. So Joëlle, I am so excited to be here to talk about your book. I discovered your work at the Byron Writers Festival and was really excited to hear from someone who was not just a writer, but actually a scientist. So often these things are distilled, all the way down. And so, it's very much a situation of Chinese whispers. And so to actually hear it from the person originating some of the science and talking to the other scientists, I think it's a really wonderful opportunity for people to hear it firsthand from you and have a perspective, not just of the Southern Hemisphere, but what's happening more globally.
Absolutely. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so obviously the starting point is the fact that you're one of Australia's leading climate scientists and that you're the lead author on the IPCC report. I was thinking that perhaps today we could start with that IPCC process, some of the top line findings that we could take away, maybe talk about how you've personally felt, and then, broaden it out into a wider kind of discussion around how community and different people can support scientists like you.
Sounds great. I'll get started. So like I said, it's terrific to be here, everyone. And as Edwina said, I was one of the lead authors on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I think many of you would be very familiar with IPCC's work, but some of you might not realize that we all volunteer our time. So on top of our usual activities of being, by and large, research scientists in different institutions around the world, we also take on this task of really taking the time to see how the climate system has changed across all of the different spheres that we have. And I think for me, my involvement with the IPCC was this life-changing experience that made me stop and need to process this through writing my book, which is called Humanity's Moment, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope. And here it is, if you haven't seen it. I managed to dig it out of a box I've just recently moved. And I guess for me, the reason why I wrote this book is that it became really clear that a lot of people aren't particularly aware of just how bad the climate crisis has really become. And as an Australian, many of you would probably recognise our country through the sort of ongoing disasters that you often see, whether it's wildfires, the bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef, and a range of other, dramatic weather and climate extremes. As an Australian scientist working on this report, there were so many extremes playing out as I was working on it. And I realized that really climate change is not this far away, distant future that we sometimes talk about. It's happening right now. And I know that people in the US would be very familiar with this, as well as you've seen an increase in things like the severity of hurricanes and wildfires and flooding. I mean, the list goes on. The Southwest has also experienced a lot of drought. The world is changing. And I felt that as a scientist, it's really, really important that I use the platform and the privileged information that I have to try and share it far and wide. Because it occurs to me that, sometimes when we talk about climate change, we can get very stuck in the statistics and the facts and the figures, and they are really important. And I do actually take a lot of careful time detailing some of those the highlights of a very extensive report. And just to give you an idea, there's 3 main volumes in the IPCC report, and they're about 1 million words each. So we're talking about 12 or 13 chapters, each of those about 80,000 words each. So it's very overwhelming for the average person. So part of the motivation was to try and distill some of that information down. But as I wrote this book and I was processing it, I guess, on that emotional level as well as, professional level, it occurred to me that, climate change is really about the people and the places that we love. And until we start to rehumanize this conversation and broaden the conversation out to include other groups, so not just talking about, the technicalities of the science or renewable energy and all these things that are certainly very, very important. For me, I felt like the missing piece of the puzzle was having a cultural conversation about our shared values, about our shared vision for the future that we want to have, and also really trying to sound the alarm, I guess, from the position that I have as a scientist who's been working in this area for close to 25 years now, teaching, researching, speaking, writing, you name it. I'm working on a podcast at the moment as well on the IPCC findings. And so I feel like it is something that I feel compelled to do and to share in a way that I hope is really accessible for people to understand. And so I guess for me, I really want to try and bring everybody on board, not just the usual suspects, the sorts of people that might usually read scientific information. I wanted to bring in people who I'm friends with. So musicians, artists, filmmakers, and just ordinary people who don't necessarily have the time to delve into scientific information. And so I guess the way, and Edwina touched on it before, my book is really broken up into 3 sections, which is called the head, the heart, and the whole. So the whole being our communities, the head obviously being the intellect and the nuts and bolts of the science. And the heart, I think, often gets overlooked because sometimes there's this outdated notion that to be a scientist, you have to be this, I guess, robotic person that isn't really moved by the information that we see. And I feel that that is an outdated notion. And I think you can still be rational and logical and professional while still having emotional responses to the work that we're in front of day in, day out. And I guess these days, and I'm sure many of you feel this, is that sometimes it's hard to sit down and watch the news or read your news feeds online. The world is changing. It's changing really rapidly, and we need to start having better conversations about what comes next. So sometimes we talk about this, there's this can be a really destructive narrative that's out there, but I'd like to have a conversation that's more about a regenerative idea about what our society could really be like. So I guess as an introduction, that's some of what I wanted to say in terms of where I come from, in terms of the sorts of perspectives and what brought me to this very moment, because I remember telling a colleague of mine who was also involved in IPCC that I'd written a book, and she just thought I was entirely crazy. How could I actually have the time and the headspace to sit down and to then write, I guess it's 100,000 words or whatever it is. But I did that because I feel it's really, really important. And I've often said this about this book. I feel like it's the most important book I'm ever going to write. The reason for that is that the next IPCC report will come out around about 2030. And around in the early 2030s, under all different climate change emissions scenarios, we'll be breaching that 1.5 degree target, which is the lower end of the Paris Agreement target. So if we can't turn it around in this critical decade, then really we start to see escalating extremes. And I guess what we're trying to do is avoid the worst aspects of climate change. And that's entirely doable, and I'm happy to talk about that. But I guess for me, to delay or to think that I can just go back to publishing my scientific research and not really engage with the public just didn't feel like I could do that anymore. It just didn't feel right to me as a person. So I guess that's the reason why I'm sitting here talking to you guys today.
Well, thank you as well for putting yourself out there, Joëlle, because who better than to deliver the scientific message than the scientist? And there are some wonderful scientists out there. Not all of them have the capacity to communicate. So when we find those communicators, I think probably the best thing we can do is take you away out of the data set and give you a platform and a microphone, because, as we know, people find it quite hard to understand the climate science. But if you had bowel cancer, you would get a diagnostic and you would go and see 3 specialists, and you would accept that diagnostic from those 3 specialists. And then you would go into, well, what am I going to do now? What are the solutions? How can I turn what is a terminal diagnostic on a complex ecosystem that we don't fully understand and have the best possible outcome? And so, you know, we wouldn't go and ask someone on the street, what do you think about this? Do I look like I have bowel cancer? You would just listen to the specialist. So we need the specialist to step up, and then we need to take that information and start looking at the solutions without trying to fully understand what we're not going to understand as non-scientific people necessarily. So I just loved your book so much. And I think the prologue is particularly touching as a real summary of your approach. I thought I'd read a quick little extract. So I think this applies to all of us. Wherever you are on this path, I want to offer you my company to let you know that you are not alone. I'm sharing my personal response to facing this unimaginable dilemma and how I've tried to navigate my own despair. I want you to know that the fear you feel is rational. So is your pain. I understand the science can often be complicated and intimidating. I'll do my best to make it digestible for you. I will shine a light into my world and provide insights I've gained from being amongst a group of the world's leading climate scientists trying to avert disaster at this critical moment in human history. So this kind of hand-holding and guiding us through the fear towards the solutions is really wonderful. And, you know, as you were saying, this human approach of sharing your own personal grief and fear is really touching. I think we'll come back to that. But firstly, thank you so much for the contribution of your time. As you said, you and all the other scientists have given your time as volunteers. And so when not very legitimate sources contest this science, you have to question why the world's leading scientists would donate like uncalculable hours, energy into this process if it wasn't 100%, you know, a necessity for humanity. So maybe talk us through a few key moments of that IPCC process.
Sure. I think for me, as I mentioned in my intro, that really working on the IPCC as these climate extremes were unfolding was a very surreal moment where there was very little distinction between my professional world and what was happening in my personal life right outside my window. So as some of you would have known, in 2019 and 2020, Australia had this really severe wildfire season where about 25% of our forest burned in a single bushfire season. During an extreme year, you might get 2%. So just to give you the sheer scale of this, it was enormous. It actually broke global records in terms of the severity and the extent of that fire. Around 3 billion animals were either killed or displaced. And now the koala, our most iconic animal, is endangered in parts of Eastern Australia and faces extinction as soon as 2050. And so this was the background of what was going on. And then some of you would remember the Pacific Northwest and the Canadian heat wave that also happened, where we were seeing temperatures in 45 degrees Celsius all the way up into the subarctic landscapes, and just seeing the decimation of these different ecosystems and the heat stress caused to human populations up there as well. So it was on the background of a very extreme period that we were writing this. And of course, COVID-19 was also happening. And so it was this very tumultuous time. And there we were trying to write this report, and things were unfolding just as as we were basically writing about it. So it was a pretty surreal moment. And I guess for me, I realized, well, if these are the sorts of impacts we'll experience with 1.2 degrees of global warming that we've already experienced, then what are we going to start to see when we get to those higher levels of warming? So when we get to 1.5 to 2 to 3 to 4, and right now, currently implemented policies around the world under the Paris Agreement see us warming, between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius, which is that sort of catastrophic overshooting of the Paris Agreement target. So clearly what we're doing is not enough. And the sorts of extremes that are playing out right now, to me, are terrifying. And so it's one of these things that I was hoping to help join the dots for people to realize, well, firstly, just how severe the situation is, that we are experiencing it all around the world. And as an Australian, I give some examples. So for instance, you can see that beautiful backdrop that Edwina's got of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. Some of you might have visited Australia and maybe had the privilege of actually snorkeling or scuba diving in that area. The Great Barrier Reef is actually the largest living organism on the planet. And since 2015, 2016, we've actually seen 50% of it die off. So we're talking about the largest living organism on the planet is now starting to die off because of heat stress related to global warming. Again, for me as an Australian, I guess even just as a scientist, that's a horrific reality to come to terms with. And even with 1.5 degrees of global warming, we see about 70 to 90% of coral reef ecosystems die off. Again, are we all good with that? I started to think to myself, like, culturally, societally, are we okay with that? What are our values around that in terms of thinking about the losses that we will experience and that we know about? And what we're seeing is consistent with what the science says. And with coral reef ecosystems, it's not just the inherent or the intrinsic beauty of those places. 25% of all marine life has some form of its life stage in coral reef ecosystems. And also there are many, many communities in the Pacific Islands, the Caribbean Islands, and other places that are deeply culturally rooted in those types of landscapes. And so we are fundamentally seeing a shift in our climate. And so one of the take-home messages, I guess, I got from the IPCC process is that the people alive today, right now, are effectively going to determine the future fate of humanity. And I remember having a conversation with the communications officer who was helping the IPCC scientists learn how to communicate some of these key messages. And I remember we just had this little moment together. We had this one-on-one training, and I said that, and we stopped, and we had to actually stop and process the reality of that. The people alive today are really going to determine the future of our planet. So it could not be a more profound moment that we find ourselves in. And so when people say to me, what's the most important thing I can do about climate change right now? The first thing I say to them is understand that you are living through this most profound moment in human history, and that you will look back at the 2020s and say to your kids or your grandkids, where was I and how did I show up? I really do believe that. So if you stop to take in the reality of that, and I'm sure many people on the call are very well aware of this, it's huge, right? It is a really big reality to take in. And it does actually start to shift the way you think about your life and the way that you operate and what it is that you can do. And so it is something that I guess can be really overwhelming because it is quite distressing to see, for instance, the sorts of ecosystem collapse that we've been witnessing here in Australia and what that means also in other parts of the world. And so I guess it leads us into some difficult and dark terrain. And once again, I'm sure many people on the call would really relate to some of what I share in my book, which is I talk about my own depression and my grapple with feeling a complete loss of faith in humanity. I mean, there are moments when I feel like we can't do this and it's too big, and it's, people are so self-interested, and that sort of darkness can overtake me at times. But then I realized that isn't the full picture. But I think sharing my own experience as someone who's in front of this information day in and day out, I mean, of course, isn't it? It is entirely a rational response to a really distressing situation. And so when I sat down to write this book, I started off, I guess, with my professional armor on, and here are the stats, here are the facts and figures about climate change. But pretty soon I realized that it was really disingenuous of me to pretend I wasn't having an emotional response where I would write material and then go off and have a bit of a cry about it, and realize that actually it's just really stressful. This is actually really stressful, and I think when you're talking about, for me, one of the chapters I found really difficult to write was around the displacement of people in low-lying areas, and particularly in the Pacific Islands, where I've had a little bit to, I've had the privilege of traveling and working in New Zealand for a few years. And for me, thinking about people having to try and relocate their villages and dig up their ancestors' graves to try and move it to higher ground, and then realizing islands are so small that ultimately there's nowhere to go, and you're literally talking about the loss of the cultural extinction of small island nations. And to me, that was really difficult, where I realized that there is this intergenerational reverberation of what we are doing to the planetary system that isn't just about the numbers on a graph, and it isn't just about, I guess, those physical metrics that scientists like me use. We're talking about the people and the places we love. And so I think it's important that people like me are honest about the reality that we face, because I'm hoping that it gives permission for other people to then be able to share how they feel. And then I would start getting emails from my colleagues saying, thank you. Thank you for writing that book. Thank you for writing the other sort of public commentary pieces I write, when I realized that it's kind of like a bit of a Me Too moment, where they also felt permission to say, actually, I'm really stressed about this as well. And I'm feeling really concerned about the future that my kids are growing up in. I'm really concerned about the data sets I'm in front of every day that are showing that, for instance, that extreme Black Summer wildfire season in Australia becomes average in just 20 years. So what used to be extremely extreme in the modern climate becomes average by the 2040s, and it becomes a cool summer by the 2060s. I mean, those sorts of things are really difficult to wrap your head around. And I suppose for me as well, is realizing that this isn't something that is happening all the way out at the end of the century, although obviously things are happening at the end of the century. It's happening right now. And so I guess I really struggled actually to think, oh my gosh, I'm going to be putting this really personal information out into the public, and what are my colleagues going to think about this? They're going to think I'm being unprofessional, all that sort of stuff. But on the contrary, I had really, really positive feedback from very senior scientists that I really admire, who were supporting me. And I guess it goes to show that sometimes the conversation can be a little bit dominated by, for instance, a lot of men, and also older men. That tends to be the demographic that you often see in science. And so being a sort of mid-career female scientist, I think women do approach things a little bit differently. And I wasn't afraid to, well, I was afraid, but I somehow worked my way through, and I did share my emotional response. And I found that a lot of men also were responding to that, but somehow I had a way of being able to explain it in a way that people could relate to. And I hope that helps also the readers. It was very much me feeling like, if I can't be honest, then how can I expect the reader to connect with me as a real human being? And I really wanted people to feel like they could come with me on a journey, that I wasn't going to barrage them with a whole bunch of information and dump them at the end with this distressing information they could do nothing with, or felt a bit powerless. And so I talked about my journey through that, because as a physical scientist, I do deal with the nuts and bolts of the science. And then all of a sudden I was starting to read, literature about social movements and thinking about art and culture. And then I realized, aha, it isn't all on the shoulders of the scientific community. We are just one sliver of the community, and we need everyone to get on board with this conversation. And thankfully, because trust me, you do not want a bunch of nerdy scientists like me leading the social movement we need to get out of this. So that's why I'm really thrilled to be talking to people like Edwina, where our cultural leaders are thinking about ways in which we can better engage the broader community. And I think that our creative arts sector is really well placed to do that, because it is that connection between the head and the heart. Because sometimes I can sit here and I can talk for another hour about the statistics of climate change and the facts and the figures. They're all in the book. Happy to talk about them, happy to take questions about them. But that isn't the bit that needs the extra conversation. The conversation that I feel that we need to have globally is really about these cultural shifts in terms of what is it that we value culturally, what is it that we're going to do in terms of thinking about, I guess, this global social movement that is underway, and thinking about this exciting moment that we're in. So it is a very challenging moment that we're in, but it's also a profoundly exciting time as well. And so I feel like I've just said a lot. I'm not sure, Edwina, if you'd like to sort of reflect on what I've said or ask me any other questions, because as you can tell, I can talk about this for a really long time. But yeah. Oh, you're on mute.
Firstly, that was wonderful. And I'm sure people are interested in some of the key stats and takeaways. So possibly we will come back, but let's take a moment to talk about this, this cultural questioning that you're talking about. You know, I've heard you mention the thing about like removing the social license of coal-fired power plants and other fossil fuel industries. And I think what's really exciting about the way you're communicating at the moment is actually asking other people to step up and help you and say, look, this is what the scientists have done. Please actually help us, because everyone, well, a lot of people in the community are very concerned, do want to help, don't feel necessarily equipped to do so, and also think, who am I to speak about this issue? I'm not a climate scientist. So to have an actual climate scientist say, please help us. And I think it is very important, firstly, to empower people and ask them to help, but also, I guess, give them a condensed top line understanding of what they should and can say, because as we know, we are awash with information in this information age. It's coming at us from every angle. What are the credible sources? And so to distill that into something like very high level of like, this is approved messaging from climate scientists. If you want to help us, this is 2 or 3 key points, or this is something, this is a useful thing to say. Because many people say things that are not necessarily useful. So I guess maybe at the end of this, or in the resources we share after, we might put together a few bullet points of what is safe and useful messages, what are some key phrases you can say that isn't supporting necessarily one environmental organization or campaign, but that really supports like the global general trend and where we need to be going. And then if someone's very passionate about a particular subject and knowledgeable on, you know, oceans or plastics or whatever that is, then they can deep dive and have that. But
absolutely. I mean, just very briefly, I can quickly go through what I think some of the key messages are, because I know that the people on the call are trained up in the Climate Reality Project, where they get a lot of really good, solid information that would be coming mostly, I guess, from the IPCC and various other sources. But I guess and my book distills a lot of that. But in terms of some of the key messages, and it's interesting to hear you say that some people feel a little bit self-conscious about, you know, being a spokesperson for such a complex issue, because it is really complicated in terms of the science. But I think some of the key messaging isn't that complex. So the first thing I mentioned earlier was that we are going to breach the 1.5 degrees of global warming target under all emission scenarios, even the lowest ones, in the early 2030s. So the implications of that are profound, as you might imagine. But a statistic that I just was looking at recently as part of this IPCC podcast that I'm doing right now, it's a 7-part series, is that there are solutions available today across all different sectors that could halve emissions, at least halve emissions by 2030. So when we talk about rapidly decarbonising our economies, it's actually achievable. So the synthesis report that came out just a few weeks ago and also Working Group 3's report on mitigation, so the solutions to climate change, is effectively a how-to guide how to do this. So that is a really, really encouraging message, that without having to wait for carbon dioxide removal technologies and so on and so forth, technologies that exist today in terms of renewable energy and all of the land-based solutions that we have could actually halve emissions, at least halve emissions by 2030. If that isn't it's a brilliant take-home message, that I don't really know what is. And I think that sometimes people forget that. One of the other key messages that I think is really important is that sometimes people get really stuck with this sort of runaway climate change idea that there's nothing we can do. It's all methane bombs and permafrost melt, and it's all a collapse of ocean circulation. Well, actually, no, it's not. So what we basically show is that how bad we let things get is still very much in our hands, and we have not locked in, runaway climate change that will result in a hothouse Earth environment. Yes, there is certainly very serious risks to the climate system as we increase those increments of global warming, and we see tipping points in the system that are certainly very important, but they are contained if we stay at those lower levels of warming. So that leads me to the next thing, which is that the currently implemented policies under the Paris Agreement, so when you see the Conference of Parties, those COP meetings, Conference of Parties meetings, right now the implemented policies are really sitting at between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius of global warming, which is really, really unacceptable. And that means that we need, so talking about the social license, it means that the people representing us at those higher policy levels are not reflecting our cultural values as local communities, as nations, as global citizenry. And so that leads us back to these conversations, which is understanding that we each have a role to play in terms of how we use our social, our political, our economic influence, whether through being a consumer, through being a voter, through all the different spheres of influence you might have in terms of those professional and personal networks that you individually have to actually make a difference. So someone like me, I speak to people from all different sectors, from community groups, business leaders. I've also been speaking at the highest federal level of the Australian government in recent weeks, which is very exciting to see that there are people even within these systems that are looking to bring about change. And I noticed that in the chat, Samuel said we have a lot of climate denialism in America. Well, I can assure you we do here too in Australia. We are the largest exporter of coal and liquefied natural gas in the world. And so the debate has been particularly fierce here in Australia. And I do document in the book basically this extraordinary federal election result that we had, where we basically threw out a government that was prepared to just, exploit fossil fuels to the bitter end. And it was this moment where people felt that their personal power as a citizen really influenced the outcome of that federal election. And maybe you can relate to that in the US as well, in terms of going from a government which was full of climate denialism to a much more progressive environment that you're in now, that we are in here as Australians. But it doesn't mean that it's a done deal. We all know that all of these social movements are this tug of war for social justice, and they never end. So, really fighting for a sustainable future and for trying to really not destabilize the planetary system is just the latest in a long, long line that we have in human history of those rights for civil rights, gender equality, you name it. There's a whole range of them. And as I was reading all that information, it made me realize that we actually have the toolkit that we need to do this. So that to me was really the missing piece of the puzzle. And writers like Rebecca Solnit, many of you would know Rebecca Solnit's classic work, Hope in the Dark. I read that from cover to cover and I absolutely loved it because it made me realize that these social movements are built by individuals, and then individuals form collectives, and then collectives can sway the rest of the community. And I came across some really interesting research that basically showed that you only really need about 25% of a population to shift a social norm. And once that social norm is shifted, the rest of the population just sort of goes with the progressive element of what's that societal change. And so if you think about it, that's really what people like you are doing. You're trying to seed that change everywhere that you can to be part of this really major social movement that we need. And that's happening all over the world, mind you. So you're not alone. That's the other thing I really wanted to say, is that you don't have to shoulder this alone. We are all in this together in every corner of the world. And that was something else I realized from IPCC, is that I could talk to a scientist from Iceland or Jamaica or India or Colombia or Canada, and we were all experiencing different elements of this global problem that we find ourselves in. So the book I just mentioned was Rebecca Solnit's Hope in the Dark. And Rebecca actually ended up contacting me, and there's a new book out called Not Too Late. It's a little anthology, and I would highly recommend particularly this group of people to grab it and read it, because it's full of very, very inspiring stories, and it really starts to tell a different story. And this is what we're all trying to do here. We're trying to tell different stories about what the future might look like. And so I guess it's one of these things that, you know, there are going to be dark times where you're not going to win. We're not going to win every single battle, but we're hoping to win the war eventually. But it's one of those things that all social movements have sort of 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. This is the story of human history, it turns out. So if you realize that, you might not get as upset when we don't always win, but if we're moving in the right direction, and you can put your sort of hand on your heart and say, I did what I could with the resources I had, and that is enough for today. That is enough for today, because you have to also live it as a human in a body and have functional relationships and not be totally crushed by the burden of this. But when you realize that you're part of a bigger social movement, and that you're actually on the right side of history here, guys, we're on the right side of history. We're not going to look back and say all those efforts we made to try and, you know, not completely destabilize the planet were wasted efforts. They're not wasted efforts. They are absolutely not wasted efforts, because if you think about the young people today, and that's something that I think about because I also teach university students, and have been profoundly also moved by Greta Thunberg and her movement of the school strikers. And she contacted me also to be a part of her book. She's got a book called The Climate Book that came out last year as well, and I contributed a chapter to that. So can you see how we're all interlinked here in a way that is, to me, very exciting? So there are times when you can feel like you're on your own with this, but I guess a group like Climate Reality is brilliant, because it is also just realizing you're part of a global network, all these different nodes all over the world, beavering away, working hard, and we're all doing that in our different ways. So maybe we'll move the conversation into those different ways now, but I guess I just wanted to say a few of those things about some of the key take-home messages, and just helping people really crystallize and understand the moment that we're in.
I think with this audience especially, you know, I think probably most of us are crushed by that. Someone mentioned profound grief, despair, all these things. So I thought that it might be interesting to actually lead the end of this conversation into the hopeful part. And there are so many interesting things happening, you know. Someone on the chat mentioned the climate denialism. I think an interesting takeaway that I had from talking to some people, some of the leading advocates in Australia, that there was like, you know, we have a population bell curve already in Australia. 75% of Australians are either climate aware or climate concerned. And as we divide those categories, essentially, as an advocate, your strategy should just be that very tail end of denialists, cut it off. It's literally, at this point, less than 1% of the population. And then the focus should just be to move everyone up one segment. So someone who's disengaged to be a little bit more engaged, someone who's engaged to take action, someone who's taking action to become, you know, really heavily invested and equip them to use their voice, and so on. And that shifting the other 99% over will actually create a tidal wave of effort. And, you know, as you said, social change, well, as we know, technology doesn't progress in a linear way. Unfortunately, the climate science is not progressing in a linear way either. And I thought, you know, when I heard you speak, Joëlle, once you mentioned like non-linear impacts and the fact that we are overshooting something that everyone here is completely aware of, but there's also the opportunity to have a non-linear social progression, and things like women's rights, you know, have actually been fought over like many hundreds of years. And although there's much work still to be done, you know, probably the big part of the progress has really happened in the last 30. And so it can feel like nothing is happening for a really long time until the tidal wave hits. And we are at the moment of the tidal wave. And so everyone start paddling, get out your surfboards and jump on that wave, because as Joëlle said, the people on this call are equipped. And so now it's a moment of breaking down those silos and those barriers. How can you communicate with the most effective information? How can you appeal to people in different forms of communication? So, you know, we absolutely need the science as the bedrock. We need the engineers and the entrepreneurs to come up with solutions. We need, you know, community groups to give social license and make things happen and purchase the products and vote. And then we need other people to communicate in different ways. And so, you know, I think most of us feel like we're banging our head against the wall trying to talk to people. Sometimes that is effective, sometimes it's not. What if you also like adopted other approaches? You know, today I've put the Great Barrier Reef, an ecosystem I'm devastated to see disappear, up. What if everyone put, you know, an animal or a species up on their next call that they really care about, and, you know, and that sparked a conversation, or, you know, appealing to people's different senses. You know, some people are, you know, empaths, and you can lead with a really deeply empathetic people. Some people are analytical, and of course, then you highlight the facts and the figures. And some people are visual, like my ex was in communications and branding and things. So I thought this type of thing, a beautiful t-shirt by an Australian designer who's created a whole series on species extinction with some facts and figures on the back, but leading with something really beautiful. And I think it's really important to have that contrast out there. You know, a lot of us in this space are, you know, so crushed by the reality, which we need to acknowledge. But as we know in life, if there's too much fear or something is too oppressive, the natural reaction is to tune out. So I guess, how can we create contrast? You know, if someone's not responding to the fact that you know, a rare species of frog is going to disappear, which would probably touch you and I and the other people on this call, maybe bring the conversation back to human health and how, you know, increased heat and bushfires and flooding may affect their personal life or their home insurance and their ability to, you know, like be insured for their next home. If they're not responding to the fear, how about we inspire them with beauty? And, you know, on the buildings of our cities, instead of having buildings lit up with lights, wasting energy, what if we projected, you know, animals like the koala that were about to go extinct with a time, you know, with a timeline ticker? We had that in Times Square, you know, a countdown. I remember at one point there was a human population countdown, which actually terrified me, as like the numbers like increased by thousands every second. Imagine if we had that for some of the animals we care about, and, you know, made it just very big and visual and something that everyone can interact with and communicate with. Obviously, that's not the solution, but how can we create these moments and link those groups?
Absolutely. I love what you've just said, Edwina. It's so inspiring to hear, you know, examples of what could be done. And I guess for me, this is why I'm putting a particular call out to the creatives out there to think about different ways, visual ways, other ways that we can engage in this material, because some people are not going to listen to the statistics about renewable energy. And, you know, there are really different ways into this. And I think that we all have unique talents and skills. And I guess it's just thinking about, I mean, obviously the way you approach a different audience has to be relevant for that particular audience, but I think we need to mainstream this whole idea of living sustainably. It's cool to be green, it's cool to save the planet, and you can see all that sort of stuff coming through in that younger generation. But I think this is where we need to get creative and start telling better stories. And who better to tell stories than our creatives, like our fiction writers, our poets, our musicians, our screenwriters. There's so many different ways of doing this that I think is really inspiring for people. And I love that shirt that you're wearing as well, because it is also this reminder of the inherent beauty that we are part of this incredible ecosystem that we call planet Earth. And it is incredible. It's the only one with life that we have, everyone. This is it. We don't have anywhere else to go. And I would rather learn about, planet Earth than Mars or Moon or any of that other stuff. We've got a lot of problems on planet Earth that we need to solve. And we are the generation that is here at this moment, alive at this time. And it is about thinking about ways that we can all get involved in this conversation, that it isn't just an environmental conversation or renewable energy or whatever it might be. It's a human being conversation, which is why the book is actually called Humanity's Moment, because it is our moment to reconnect with our collective humanity, something I very much connected with when I was working at the IPCC at that UN level, where there are people from all over the world in that room, from Colombia to India to Iceland to Russia, you name it, everyone was there. It was extraordinary. And just very finally, because I think Madeline would like us to get on to a couple of audience questions, I was just going to say that really when you're in those dark moments and you think, human nature is awful and terrible, stop and think about the people that go out and fight the wildfires, or the COVID nurses who sit there day in, day out trying to protect our communities, or the IPCC scientists who devoted all their time, or you guys going out there and speaking to all the different groups. You cannot say that people do not care about this. I used to think that, and then I realized when I started hearing from people all over the world that no, actually a lot of people really, really care about this. But we need to have different conversations, and we need to have more inclusive ways. So my book is basically chock full of all of my ideas to help seed your own conversations. I don't have all the answers. I'll save you the suspense right now. I don't have all the answers, but I'm really hoping. I've drawn on literature from all over the world. It's a truly global book. It's just because I'm Australian, it's not just Australian. And you don't have to be a scientist to read it, so don't freak out. Trust me, my best friend is a yoga teacher. She read it from cover to cover, and she was texting me as she read it and just saying, thank you, Jo, for writing this book, because I understand it now. I understand it now. And so with that, why don't we pass over to questions, Madeline? Thank you, Edwin. It's always so good to talk to you. So much to say.
Thank you both so much. And I'll definitely give you a chance at the end also to wrap up with any sort of final and closing thoughts that you might have. And I just want to call out everybody in the chat. I feel like everyone's just been so communicative and so responsive, and really identifying with the idea that like fear doesn't work. Like that's just not something that's been persuasive for a really long time. People want solutions that are meaningful, that are realistic, that are personal to them, and really want to be able to do it. And there are folks literally ordering the book as we speak. So I'm so pleased about the reach of it. So I want to call out a question from Rebecca Burton, who wants to sort of reflect on your comment on rehumanizing homeostasis for like managing the human population with the populations of the other species that we share this planet with. And so to hopefully like withstand climate change. Do you feel like we need to cut back human inhabitation of our Earth? How do we feel like we can be in homeostasis and rehumanize that?
Yeah, it's quite a complex and interesting question. Look, obviously the human population is growing at a rate that is sort of outstripping our ability to live sustainably on this planet. This has been the case for some time. It really accelerated since the 1970s, but obviously we've overrun the Earth. There's a statistic I put in there that in the book, which basically says that only 3% of natural ecosystems are considered ecologically intact. Just take a moment to absorb that horrific information, right? 3%. That is crazy. So obviously we need to think about the level of, the population level that's there. But we find that with education, when that increases and people's socioeconomic, level increases as well, that those numbers start to go down. But what we can do is basically live more sustainably with the population that we do have. So the average Australian and American, again, I put in some pretty eye-watering statistics about how much we consume in terms of, say, for instance, with meat. I think the average American and Australian consume about 100 kilograms of meat, where the average Indian per year, where the average Indian is about 3 kilograms per year. So we can stop to think about what it is that we do on that individual level, obviously on community level and at national level. But yes, we've overrun the earth. That they're David Attenborough's words. I put a quote in by him because he's obviously studied the natural world and seen this firsthand. And so it's a good question. It's a complex answer. I do talk about the concept of regenerating ecosystems and bringing in Indigenous knowledge in terms of, we know how to do this. People have been doing this in Australia for 60,000 years, as Edwina said right at the start. It's just having different conversations that are more inclusive, and there's a real moment of healing to be had in these, at this particular moment, I believe, cross culture and cross generations as well.
Definitely. Agree. This is an anonymous question that I have here, but I actually really like it, which is, I feel like we're preaching to the choir, as we've said a million times while we're talking here. You know, everyone on this call, I think, feels very, very similarly, is really resonating, I think, like with the content that you're sharing, that Edwina is sharing as well. So how do we connect to the people who have the power to make real change? What is your perspective on kind of getting to that next level? How can we do that?
I think what Edwina was saying before is really important about that, you know, we can divide the community up into different sectors of people that are kind of engaged, somewhat engaged, and just moving people up different levels. But I also want to reiterate that it's actually really unhelpful at this point in time to be trying to have conversations with people who simply deny the reality of the science. For me, these days, I just don't engage. I don't have the time. I genuinely do not have the hours in the day to sit there and have these conversations that are just pointless at that point. So there are always going to be some people that just aren't going to get it. And it doesn't matter, it turns out, because as I was mentioning, we need 25% of the population to shift the social norm, right? That's happening all over the world. So I think, you know, maybe there isn't something so wrong about preaching to the choir after all, because we need to stay motivated, we need to stay active, we need to stay the driving force of the social change and the social movements that we need. But the reality is that you're not going to get everyone. It's as simple as that. And maybe if you drop the bar and stop feeling that sense of responsibility around that, that might help you. Maybe it won't. This is just my own thoughts in terms of how I've been managing it. And then when you, sometimes you find that when you take a bit of a different approach, people come to you and all of a sudden I am speaking to our federal treasury at the moment because she managed to read my book, was very moved by it. This is a macroeconomist, not someone I usually talk to, trust me. And we're now having conversations about how they're thinking about how they can rehumanize economics in the current government to think about what we can do. So I guess I have maybe a slightly different reach to maybe some of the people on the call, but you all have your own networks. So it might be whether it's the CEO of a particular organization or, you know, your pension funds, or there's a range of different things. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that we all have our influence. We're not going to change the world, but collectively we might. But right. It's just thinking about, don't waste your energy on the 0.1% of people who are never going to get it and they're just being unhelpful at this stage. So trust me, you're part of a bigger movement. Focus on those people, focus on shifting, as Edwina said so eloquently earlier, different levels of engagement and stepping it up to different degrees. So if you now are aware, then what can you do beyond that to do something?
I love that. Sorry, Edwina, go for it.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, the beginning of the question was around like the people who are making the decisions. So obviously voting is incredibly important. I'm sharing this example because I think it's actually very relevant to the American context. Within the space of like 24 to 48 months, so 2 years, a new like political climate movement has arisen in Australia that was also like less polarized than America. I mean, I think most people on this call would feel deeply frustrated at the political polarization in America and the fact that the two groups are not at all speaking to each other. It was, yeah, also had a very like hard right pro coal gas thing. We kind of had a center left and a Green Party, but I guess that was getting good results in the votes, but never enough to, you know, really get into parliament. And in the last 24 months, we've had the rise of something called the Teals, which are these like pro-climate kind of socially progressive, but also a bit like economically conservative people that have come. All of them are women, highly educated, doctors, Olympians, community leaders who have stepped up and who have actually won major seats in lots of Australia and have really created a balance of power between the right and the left, and who are able to now, you know, have a voice in Parliament. So look up Australian Teals politics. I think it's
in
really
the book. I talk about it.
Okay. Great,
Yeah.
read it in the book. And I think in terms of being strategic, obviously there's strategic litigation, which is happening increasingly. There's some amazing things happening there. Shareholder activism in Australia, for example, we have a group called Market Forces where you can find out about AGMs. You have, you know, moving the money is the most vital piece, and don't worry, the politics will follow the money. So shareholder activism. And I thought quite an interesting strategy is obviously there are all these campaigns where you can very easily, you know, enter your email and follow, and you go into like being hundreds of thousands of people contacting people about some shareholder resolution. But I started looking at those things and going, oh, okay, this company is going to vote on this thing, looking at who the board members were, and then writing to them personally on LinkedIn, you know, as professional to professional, because so often the board members are like behind this corporate veil, like, oh, it's a company decision. And so I'd write to them a very polite, you know, email as a fellow professional and say, you know, I know you're voting on this. Have you considered this in this decision? This could have implications for your business. This is the business case. I'm also appealing to you as a human. I see you have 3 children, And people started to respond to me in those LinkedIn messages, which weren't an attack, but, you know, kind of had a personal conversation saying, you are actually making this decision. And I guess how are you going to respond to that personally? And so that is like at the top end of town. But how do we reach more people like with this hopeful message? There's a great documentary called 2040, which again was about the climate solutions that already exist. If we started doing these now, what would 2040 look like? And it was a positive picture of the future. I think that's really important. Through the Environmental Music Prize, my main objective is really around systems change. Artists and bands are actually the largest group of influencers collectively on social media. And so how do you empower that group to, you know, communicate in a different way? How do you inspire them to create new forms of music and stuff that will touch a whole emotional palette? You know, obviously there are the like climate angst songs, but there's also songs about beauty and the places that we love or the animals that we love. And I think, you know, we have the knowledge. Once we've engaged people, we can share that, but probably to lead with hope, and not just blind hope, but like an actual positive vision for the future. Then you get people to buy in and say, okay, what do we need to do? And you're like, I have a plan. Or here is where you can get the information.
Absolutely. So many good suggestions in there, Edwina. And isn't it exciting, guys, to think about we are having these conversations and we are part of influencing this social change? I personally find that so inspiring.
No, it's wonderful. I mean, I've just, you know, I feel like both of your responses captured so well, like this is urgent. This is a real problem, but there's a way to approach this that doesn't lead to like immediate burnout and anxiety at the same time. You can be urgent and hold that same message while still having such optimism and like deep relationships with each other and like this sort of like calming to your own anxiety.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And just on that point, Madeline, I was going to say in my book, I also talk about how I, as an individual, try and manage that anxiety that I feel. And I talk about how For me, it's sometimes getting into the ocean or going to an art gallery or listening to my favorite music up really loud or being really still or doing some yoga or whatever it is that grounds you. Do that thing because it's really important. That is your anchor, that still place within yourself, that is a human being on the planet in a body, is still very urgent. So I think it's really important that the work that you do does have an emotional toll, and it can be really, really, really stressful. And I hope that sharing my own journey, because trust me, as a climate scientist, I'm really in front of it all the time. And that's why I can see the real polarization of the very worst of humanity sometimes and the very best of humanity. And sometimes the black and white thinking won't get you too far. So just bring it back into the middle and remember that sometimes people will be wonderful and all those beautiful things will happen, and other times it will not. And that's okay. And you did your best for that day. And there are different ways that we can go about grounding ourselves, being connected to each other. And I talk about those things. And I hope that please stick with the book as well. There'll be a time, and even when I wanted to stop writing it. So if you do read the book, read it to the end, and particularly for a sensitive person or an artist, please read it to the end, because there's a special message in there for you. And I hope it helps. And that's why when I was writing it, the subtitle is, so the book's called Humanity's Moment, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope. I didn't realize I was writing a case for hope. I didn't know where that book was going to lead me, but I did find genuine hope. And as someone that sort of struggles with depression, trust me, it was hard-earned hope. It wasn't this sort of Pollyanna, superficial hope. Let's just put a chapter about hope at the back of the book to make my publisher happy. It wasn't like that, guys. It was really, how do I actually find meaning? How do I get up in the morning and get out of bed and still do this work kind of hope, like deep diving hope. How do you find it when you really feel a lot of despair? So I hope by being real about those dark places in myself, that it will help you on your darker days and also on your good days as well, when you're feeling good and charged up and inspired. So I don't know if we have any final questions, but I've enjoyed the conversation.
Definitely as well. And I feel I just want to highlight for folks, I've also posted the link again from Island Press, where you can get 25% off of Joelle's book with the available link there. But also just want to thank you so much for your vulnerability and your candidness as well about mental health and like the spaces that takes us. And I think, you know, being realistic and transparent with each other is such a helpful step for so many of us. I think I don't want to keep folks for too much longer. I do want to wrap up the conversation. Joëlle, I feel like you had a beautiful closing statement just now, but if there's anything else that you wanted to add, and Edwina, I also want to make space for you to, if there's anything else that you want to add or share about the Environmental Music Prize as well. I definitely want to give you all both a moment to share any closing thoughts.
I just want to thank everyone for taking the time out of their evenings, their afternoons, or their mornings to be on this call, and just to thank you for your effort, whatever it might be, however small or large, and the sacrifices that you make to do what you can at this moment. But I also want to say you're not alone, and that we're all really in this social movement, and hopefully this conversation and maybe even the book will inspire you to realize that you're part of this global movement. And for me, it's so exciting to be speaking to a US audience. My book is being released internationally, which is very exciting to feel like this is a message that just isn't for one group of people around the world. It is a global message. You're a part of that. Thank you for your attention and for your presence today. And I hope that it just helps you in some way on your journey. So good luck.
Yeah, and thank you again, Joëlle, for really your work. This conversation is going to be recorded. I really encourage people to share widely and be part of the conversation. I also encourage you all to like mix it up in terms of how you communicate. We'll share the finalists of the Environmental Music Prize this year. It's only in its second year, but we have some of Australia's leading artists that are involved. So there's some really high quality music videos there. And next year we'll be launching internationally and make it a global prize. So we're excited to be part of that. You'll find 22 songs that inspire action for climate and conservation. So maybe start your next meeting with one of those songs, and then maybe talk about a totally other, whatever you work in engineering or thing. But, you know, this moment for people to kind of reflect. And then if they ask you about it, say, well, you should read Joëlle's book, of course. And there are those songs. Another great piece I would say is Massive Attack did a collaboration with Christiana Figueres. It's like a 4-minute piece, which basically sums up this intersectionality of, climate, humanity, politics, COVID, everything. So that's a great one too.
Brilliant.
Wonderful. Thank you both. I like I said before, I was just honored to have part of this conversation and to sort of be a fly on the wall for most of it. And just want to say thank you, and a big thank you from folks in the chat as well who are engaging with this work today, and who I hope will continue to as well. And I think those were wonderful suggestions, Edwina, to sort of continue to just sort of make this a part of your meetings, make this a part of your conversations. There's so many different ways and entry points for a lot of people. It doesn't always have to be the hard conversation. There's little pieces that you can do on a daily basis. So just a huge thank you. And then for our audience as well, this was our sort of public climate reality book club. We do these conversations with authors not infrequently. So please stay tuned for the next one. Hopefully we'll have just as wonderful conversationalists as we had today. And to please stay tuned for what's coming, and we'll be to also share out this recording. Please share widely, please distribute with others, and any associated links that we have from our conversation today. I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists, and then also to our audience for their evening or morning with us. Take care, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day or night. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.